Hi everyone, my name is Yolla McCoy and I'll be helping Gary with this webinar. Thank you all for joining us today for a webinar that has been organized jointly by Feedwater and Accepta because we felt it's an important topic and we wanted to get as much attendees as possible. The webinar today will be focusing on the safety methods and procedures that have to be followed to open buildings after either partial or complete lockdown. But at the end of the presentation, if you have any questions regarding other systems or cooling towers, please feel free to ask us and one of us will answer your question. Throughout the seminar, you will be able to write your questions. And if you prefer to have an open discussion, please leave this to the end and then we will have about 20 minutes for discussion. For attendants from the Middle East as well, you have the options to ask your questions in Arabic or in English. I speak both languages, so it's whatever you prefer. Now, before we start the seminar, I'd like to introduce the main speaker today, Gary Hogben, and we're really very lucky to have him talk about a topic that I feel he's one of the best really in the UK in terms of knowledge about Legionella in domestic and industrial systems. Gary is a principal UK scientist. He's a chartered biologist and a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology. As I said before, he has extensive experience in Legionella control and has contributed to producing many official documents, European and UK-based documents, and he has been part in an advisory role for the HSE when they produced HSG 274 and HSG 282. So we have to partly blame him really for whatever is in these documents. So I'm gonna now switch my camera off. Hope you enjoy this webinar and I'll join you once Gary finishes his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yola. Thanks for the kind words. I only lay claim to the good bits of all those documents, by the way. Everything else is the responsibility of other people. But let's start today by talking about what we're going to discuss. We want to understand why Legionella control is a special consideration in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to look at how you can safely assess the risk from your building system so that you can reopen them in a safe manner. And that really will involve making a plan for reopening the building. So it's important to write things down as to what you're going to do in relation to safe reopening. The human body is fitted with two high-efficiency optical sensing devices called your eyes. It's really important to use your eyes and make sensible decisions based on the evidence that you can obtain by that means. We'll be talking about when disinfection might be necessary, and it will be necessary, of course, in quite a few cases, but we'll also perhaps be able to understand when it won't be necessary to do a full-scale system disinfection. And we'll be talking about reinstating the control measures that you normally use to keep Legionella growth under control. And finally, we'll talk about some validation sampling for Legionella, the role of sampling in this sort of situation, and record keeping. So the importance of keeping records is absolutely crucial, because if you don't write down what you have done to control Legionella in this post-COVID period, then it will be assumed that you've done nothing in the event of an outbreak, and that could leave you with some very serious consequences indeed. Now, as Yola has indicated, we will be able to take some questions afterwards, but if your questions are very specific about your system, then please do feel free to email either of us on these email addresses and indeed call us on the telephone numbers after the session. So why is Legionella a special consideration in the post-COVID era then? Well, firstly, because normal advice for Legionella control is based on certain key principles. The first key principle is that you keep your hot water hot and or use biocides like chlorine dioxide. So hot water is probably the most commonly applied treatment, but you can also use chlorine dioxide or other treatments in addition to that, or as a substitute to temperature. We also rely on keeping cold water cold, and again the same principles apply, that you can use biocides as either an additional control or as a substitute control. We normally want to keep systems clean because if a system is clean, it will have reduced nutrient for Legionella, and therefore it'll help you to control growth. And we also want it to be kept moving because Legionella loves stagnant water surfaces. If you have warm water, if you have dirty water, if you have stagnant water, you can pretty much rely on having Legionella problems at some point in the future. Now, during COVID, each of these control measures may well have been compromised. With hot water not flowing around systems, neither with cold water, and systems may become dirty. So what we've seen is with hot water systems, they've been turned off perhaps for some period of time, they're underused, and then they're not flowing around the system. So even if they were maintained at temperature, we're not seeing thermal disinfection effects around the building. Cold water systems will be stagnant too, and especially in the UK at the moment, we've had a bit of a heat wave recently. We're coming into what passes for our summer, and we will see that cold water systems will be getting warmer too. So once they're above 20 degrees C in the UK, that's a sort of alarm figure, because we know that Legionella growth starts at about 20 degrees C. We know that when you have cold water storage tanks that haven't been moving, you will have so-called products of stagnation. So you will get deposits in tank, you'll get deposits on the bottom of tanks, you will get deposits floating on the surface of tanks, and you will get growth of biofilm on internal surfaces of those tanks as well. And we know that we will have stagnant water, so we've got low flow and little used outlets. And each of these situations you really could describe as heaven for Legionella. Okay? It's exactly the location in which Legionella would like to grow. So they all promote the growth of Legionella, but we mustn't assume that everything is going to be dramatically bad. Yeah, we have to make a decision as to what our systems are looking like based on an understanding of risk. And of course, in the UK, the regulations are really, the guidance is published by the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE, and they clearly state that effort to control risk should be proportional to risk. So in other words, if you have a system which is high risk, you should be expected to do a great deal about controlling that. But on the other side of the coin, if your system is low risk, then you can be expected to do relatively little. Of course, relatively little does not mean ignore. It still means you're going to have to do something. But hopefully it will not be too dramatic and expensive for people with lower risk systems. So HSE have published some national advice on reopening of water systems, and you can get that from the link here. And we will be supplying this information in separate form after the session, so please don't think you have to scribble that link down. But HSE has published that guidance. The Legionella Control Association is the lead industry body in the United Kingdom, and they work closely with the HSE, and they too have published their guidance. And the two sets of guidance are pretty complementary to each other. Okay, so there's no disagreement. If we follow one, you'll be pretty much following the other. And in Europe, then the European Study Group for Legionella Infection has also produced guidelines specifically with regard to accommodation sites. So you can get copies of all of these either from the internet or from Feedwater, available on request. So what we're going to talk about today is really a distillation of the contents of each of these documents, so that we can hopefully give you more specific advice for your systems. So the LCA guidance is probably the best place to start in this regard. So within that guidance, there is a very useful table. Okay, so the table on recommissioning your building water systems. What is it that we have to do to do them safely? So we can start at the top of the flow diagram here. So recommission the building water systems. The first question to ask: is there any previous history of positive Legionella samples from the water system? Well, if the answer to that is yes, then inevitably we're going to go down this pathway here, which involves a cleansing flush, system disinfection, followed by validation sampling. Okay, so if you have a water system which has a historic record of Legionella positives, then really cleansing flush and disinfection are going to be required. Okay, but once you've carried out that process, then you can follow the pathway down the left-hand side of the screen here, and you end up with the ability to reopen. Once you've documented the process, taken all of your evidence into account and all your decisions, then you can reinstate your system. If the answer to the question at the top here, is there any previous history of positive results, is no, okay, then you have to ask a further question. Has the system remained in normal use, or has it been flushed to simulate use? If the answer to that is yes, then you should be able to provide some evidence for that. So you can take readings from your water meter, for instance, to demonstrate water use, and you can also record the temperatures of the water as it's been circulated around the building. You then need to consider, well, is validation sampling necessary? So in bigger buildings, it almost certainly will be, and we'll consider more about this when we get down to validation sampling. But once you've made that consideration, then you're down on the same process all the way to reopening. But if your system has not been flushed, it's not been simulating normal use, if the answer is no, in other words, then we have to ask a further question. Is the system a simple system as defined in HST 274 Part 2? And we're going to look at what that definition of a simple system is in a moment. But if it is classified as a simple system, then flush as a minimum. Consider whether you need to disinfect the system and carry out some validation sampling. So once you've made those decisions in the yellow box there, then you can move down the pathway towards reopening. If the system is not a simple system, though, as defined in the in HST 274, then we have to consider these aspects here. So a cleansing flush, system disinfection, followed by validation sampling. So bigger systems that have not been closed down or flushed to simulate normal use, that they, even if they have not had a history of Legionella positives in the past, will always require cleansing flush, system disinfection, and validating sampling. So let's have a look at let's have a look at levels of risk, rather, forgive me. So HSC stressed already that effort must be proportional to risk, and some systems are inevitably lower risk. And whether a system is low risk or not is often related to the size of the system. If you think of the biggest buildings for which you are responsible, the smaller of those buildings have small water systems, of course, as well, and they will tend to be places, water systems, where there are no little nooks and crannies where Legionella may well be hiding away and growing. There are no cold spots in the hot water systems, or fewer cold spots in the hot water systems. But bigger buildings, by contrast, almost inevitably have lots of places where Legionella can hide. We know that healthcare and care home premises are higher risk simply because of the number of vulnerable people present within those premises, so they're always going to fall into high risk categories. And accommodation sites are also likely to be higher risk because we know that accommodation sites are responsible for a large number of Legionella disease cases. In 2007, WHO said that 20% of all Legionella cases detected were associated with the hospitality industry and travel industry. So we know that hotels have a big level of risk, and we know why. Hotels have more risk of infection simply because they have more individual people. If you have a factory, for instance, with 1,000 workers in there, a large factory, the people exposed to water from that factory will tend to be the same 1,000 people every working day, won't they, with a few additionals. But in a hotel, if you have 1,000 guests in a very big hotel, those 1,000 guests are going home in the next few days, and they're going to be replaced by another 1,000 guests who will have different levels of susceptibility. So the number of individual people crossing the threshold of hotels is always going to be very high, and therefore the numbers who might be susceptible to infection is also going to be high, isn't it? So accommodation sites are always in the higher categories. And we know that generally larger buildings will have more control issues simply because of the complexity of the systems. So let's go back to these low risk systems then, okay? So HST 274 Part 2 defines a low risk system as a small building without people especially at risk from Legionella bacteria, where daily water usage is inevitable and sufficient to turn over the entire system, where the cold water comes directly from a wholesome main supply, in other words, there are no stored water tanks, and where hot water is fed from instantaneous heaters or low storage volume water heaters. In the UK, we consider those to be less than 15 litres, but they do have to supply outlets at 50 degrees C, and where the only outlets are toilets and hand wash basins. So, for instance, that means there were no showers in the building. If your building meets these requirements, then you can genuinely categorize them as low risk. And so, in other words, the corrective actions required to reopen after COVID is to flush the system, verify the temperatures are within your normal control limits. So by that we mean the cold water should in the UK be below 20, and in most other parts of the world it should be below 25. And the hot water should be at 50 degrees C at each of the taps. And if you have any central water storage, then it should be 60 in that central water storage. But the key point is coming out of the taps at 50. So how do we take this information and collate it into what is the joint Feedwater and Accepta view? Well, once low risk buildings are out of the way, if you like, we have to decide what is high risk and therefore what actions are needed in a high risk and medium risk situation. So this is based on our knowledge of Legionella growth and our experience in control, but it is guidance only. Duty holders, people who know what their individual buildings are going to have to make the decision. They know what their data is like for their buildings and how their building is used. But obviously we can help, and we will help people to decide which actions are appropriate. And there is inevitably going to be some fluidity between medium and high risk. You know, you won't be able to have a one-size-fits-all approach and say this building is definitely medium risk and this building is definitely high risk. But we hope we can give you some guidance as to what category you might fall in. So let's start with considerations of medium risk then. So at medium risk buildings will generally be all accommodation sites, hotels and halls of residence, etc. So we're talking here perhaps about the smaller accommodation sites and hotels. Office sites will tend not to have lots of vulnerable people in there, so they will perhaps tend to fall in the medium risk category. Industrial premises generally would also follow that. Premises where consistent and effective flushing has been applied. So this is an area where you can say that if you shut your building down in a planned way at the time of the COVID lockdowns, then you now reap the benefits because you fall into a more medium risk category rather than a higher risk category. This would also apply perhaps to premises that have remained open but have reduced capacity during the lockdown. But as long as the water has still been flushed throughout the whole of the system, so you don't have large parts of the building where the water has not been used. We also consider medium risk to be premises with no history of positive Legionella results. You know, we see lots of buildings without our laboratory remit where we've tested for many, many years and not had any Legionella positive results. You know, so it would be wrong to place those automatically in a high risk category when we know that ordinarily the system runs safely. Now the item in red here is an attempt really to put a value on size. Okay, so premises with occupancy of between 50 and 100 persons per day, we would consider to be a medium-sized area, and therefore we've thought about this and we think that we can put them in the medium risk category. So you can ask the question of your buildings: how many people are in these buildings on a daily basis? And if it's between 50 and 100, then medium risk may well be the appropriate place for you. So what do you have to do with a medium risk situation then? Well, on the right-hand column, you can see here, we want you to inspect the system and record your findings. Remember what I said about using your eyesight at the start. Have a look at the system and see what the information you can gather just by looking. You certainly should consider the need for full system disinfection because even though this might only be a medium risk scenario, you may feel that system disinfection is appropriate. But you can also consider using increased dosage of continuous biocide. So for instance, if your buildings have an active oxychlorine dioxide system, it will be possible to increase the dosage on a temporary basis so that you get more biocide flowing through the system. So we'll deal with that in more detail in a few moments' time. We certainly want you to get your hot water systems hot before you bring them back online. Now, most people have turned their hot water systems off if the buildings have been vacant. So we want you to get your hot water systems back up to 70 degrees C and then flush that piping hot water throughout the entire part of your system to introduce thermal disinfection into the system. We'd like you to consider flushing the water system and verifying that your water temperatures and biocide levels are in specification. So in other words, you need to get that cold water from the water main and distribute it around the building. In doing so, you will be getting rid of any Legionella that's built up in the pipework and so forth and the distribution network during the COVID period. But you'll also be bringing the cold water there so that you can arrest the growth of any Legionella that is remaining. So it's a twofold effect when you flush the water system. And we want you to consider and devise a sampling plan to cover the period before and after opening and undertake Legionella sampling. Because we do think that sampling, whilst it's not a control measure in itself, will give you some knowledge of the effectiveness of your control measures. But it's also important not to sample extensively. You know, you have to devise an appropriate sampling plan based on your size of building. So as we move up the scale then, high-risk premises, these would include really any site where a planned COVID-19 shutdown was not carried out. So in other words, if the building has been shut down, locked up, and people have walked away without taking any actions, then inevitably those systems are going to be in a worse condition. We're talking really about any site where flushing and control measures have not been consistently applied as well. So if buildings have been empty for a long period of time, nobody's been going in, they will inevitably be higher risk. If you've had premises with a history of Legionella positive results, in other words, where you've had the previous sampling has told you that the system is colonised with Legionella, then we can expect that that colonisation will have got a lot worse while the systems have been under reduced use or shut down. Healthcare premises, care homes and places where vulnerable persons are present are always going to fall in the high risk category. We know from years of decades indeed now of experience that Legionella is an infection that preys upon people who are already ill and old. Okay, so if you have old people, if you have people who are already poorly, especially people with immunocompromised status, then we really do need to ensure that those systems are safe before we expose them to the water from within them. So any site that's been completely closed during the lockdown. And then our red text here, again, this is Feedwater and Accepta decision, premises with a regular occupancy of over 100 persons per day. If you have buildings like that, then inevitably they are going to be considered higher risk, because with a large number of people, you're getting a large number of people who may be prone to infection. So the high risk situation is inspect the system and record your findings, undertake a full system disinfection. You can do this by increasing dosage of continuous biocides as well, which we'll come on to in a moment, or you can do shock dose disinfection. You can do thermal disinfection by pasteurizing the chlorifiers and bringing all of your hot water systems to the target temperature before you put them back into normal use. You certainly should be flushing the water system and verifying that your water temperatures and biocide levels are within specifications. So over a period of time as well, not just on the day you did the first test, make sure that they are within temperature and specification for several days before you reopen the buildings. And you should be devising a sampling plan to cover the period before and after opening. And sampling in this context in high-risk premises is really going to be essential. So please make sure that you take appropriate numbers of samples, and you can consult with us as to what appropriate sampling plan may be for your individual building. So you need to make a plan. You need to set out what you're going to do in writing. You need to specify what your normal control measures are, and if they're going to change for the reopening phase. So for instance, you may say that our hot water system typically runs at 60 degrees C at the calorifier and at 50 degrees C at the tap. But for a period during the opening phase, you're going to do a thermal disinfection, so those temperatures will be different. So write out what it is that you intend to do, and of course, once you've done it, keep those records. You should detail what inspections you need to perform. Right? So this will normally include inspecting of tanks especially, and any part of the system that you would ordinarily inspect in your Legionella control program. You should list the taps and the outlets that you need to flush, and provide that list to the people who are going to be doing the flushing, so that they can account for each and every one of them that they have flushed. And then decide on what disinfections you need. Do you need to disinfect the whole system? Do you need to disinfect some components of the system, for instance, things like shower heads and so forth? Or do you need to increase the dosage of any continuous biocide treatment? So what the disinfections are and how you're going to carry it out. You should then also detail the samples you're going to require, and really get your bottles ordered. There is going to be a big rush in laboratories on sampling for Legionella. So if you know you're going to need some samples taken, then please do get your requests in for sample bottles now, and tell the laboratories, because they will need to know what type of media to order and how busy they are going to be. And then you should specify your target dates. When are we going to reinstate these control measures? When are we going to do the sampling? When are we going to do the inspections and so forth? So have a documented plan which you can show to any regulator who asks the questions in the future. You also have to consider the health and safety for your own people, the people involved in reinstating your system. So staff involved in control will potentially have increased exposure to Legionella. As you open a tap which hasn't been used for several months, for instance, there may well be more Legionella in that area. So this should be considered as part of a risk assessment. And really, the advice I would give you is you need to minimize exposure to aerosols. So, for instance, don't run the taps at full flow when you start to flush them, because if you run them at full flow, you'll get much more splashing. If you get much more splashing, then you will get much increased amounts of aerosol. You can consider removing the shower heads before flushing, for instance. So this is another way of reducing the aerosols. And once you've got the shower heads removed, then it's very important that you descale them and clean them. Because if there's one part of the system that you can pretty much guarantee Legionella have been happily growing, it'll be within shower heads in systems. So don't allow people to use those showers in that condition. Get them descaled and clean. Now, you can consider the use of PPE, such as a appropriately rated mask. They're not always easy to get your hands on these days, but it's more important to exclude other people from the area and not to use vulnerable people for this work. So if you have members of staff who might be more at risk of infection, please don't set them up to do this. Get somebody else on to do this work, and you will have much less likelihood of any problems associated with that. You should certainly exclude other staff or people from the area during the process. So this is a private task, if you like. Okay, so do it when there's nobody else around the buildings, and then you simply not be exposing people to any aerosols from that system. So let's now discuss the need for inspection. Okay, so we're talking here principally, I guess, about cold water storage tanks. Stagnant water promotes growth. Water is a great growth medium for bacteria, and especially so for Legionella. And you will see growth appear either as deposits on the surfaces, on the bottom of the tank, or indeed on the surface of the water. Now, sometimes you look into a stagnant cold water storage tank and you can see a thin film on the surface of the water. That is itself mostly bacterial growth. Perhaps there'll be some scale involved in there as well, but generally it's bacterial growth. If you're seeing that inside your cold water storage tank, then you know your tank has been supporting microbial growth. You're also looking for colonization of any surface with biofilm. In tanks that haven't been used for a long period of time, you may well see that there is a material growing on the surface of the tank. You may be able to feel it by touch as slimy material. You may see that there are lots of fungal elements growing within tanks. Tanks have been sat there for a while and condensation has been reforming. You may see fungi, for instance. You may indeed smell problems when you open the tank. If the tank has been growing microbes, there won't always be a smell, so you can't rely on your sense of smell for this. But sometimes you open the tank and you think, yes, definitely there's been a problem in here because you can smell them. We also need to consider what's been happening with the smaller animals, if you like. In the UK, it's been a source of some amusement to people to see deer and goats and sheep running in the streets of our cities and towns because people haven't been around. Well, the smaller ones, the rats and the mice and everything else, and the spiders and the insects have also been running amok inside your buildings while we've not been there. So do inspect your systems and make sure there's no evidence of ingress of vermin or insects into parts of the system that may have been open. If there have been, you will inevitably need to disinfect, and you will also need to make sure that the way they got in is prevented in future. So in other words, you may need to do some remedial work on the condition of the tank rather than just disinfection. We're certainly also interested in knowing if there have been any temperature spikes. So when you open your cold water storage tanks, take the temperatures. We want to know the temperature of the water away from the inlet and close to the inlet, because that will tell us if there's been any significant temperature gain within that tank. You certainly might encounter taste and odor problems downstream of the tank in systems that have been stagnant. And when your workers come back to the office, they will certainly tell you if they think that the water is tainted. So let's help prevent that before they do come back. And the overall tank condition is important as well. Is the tank intact? Is there any way anything can get in? Is the insulation on the tank satisfactory, and so forth? Depending on the answers to those questions, of course, you will have a list of things that you're going to have to do before you can reopen the building. And then that brings me to the final point on the slide. You need to act on your findings. So get these inspections done early, because they may well generate activities that are going to take some time to do. You don't want to be delaying opening your buildings again because you've got to get a repair done on a tank. So do this first, and let's have the actions carried out. So what is the requirement for disinfection? Well, it is almost certainly likely to be necessary for the bigger systems and any system with inadequate pre-lockdown closure, any system with inadequate ongoing control, flushing, etc. Accommodation sites, so I strongly recommend that you consider disinfection in one form or another. And older systems will tend to have unusual water systems, if you like, more nooks and crannies for things to hide away. Any site with previous colonisation problems, if you've had Legionella problems in the past, it's very difficult to eliminate entirely. That's why we always talk about Legionella control. But if you've had colonisation previously and you've now had a lack of control measures during the COVID period, then you are much more likely to need to have a disinfection now. And certainly any premises with healthcare premises or premises with vulnerable people should be considered as urgent requirement for disinfection before reopening. But we also have to define what we mean by disinfection. So it doesn't have to be a full chemical shock dose disinfection. So there are alternative disinfection strategies you can use. So for instance, if you have continuous low-level biocide dosing, for example, active chlorine dioxide, then you can increase the amount of chlorine dioxide going through the system in order to achieve a disinfecting effect. So a simple process to carry this out is given heat. You warning notices that the water is not fit for drinking, because there will be temporarily an increase in chlorine dioxide level in the system. Make sure that you increase the dosage to the desired level, and you may need to consult with us as precisely how to do that in our system. Consult with your own manufacturer if you have different systems. You should part drain the tank and refill it. If you have a big tank into which is being dosed an active biocidal product, it will take a long time to raise the content of that tank to the target level. So drain off the water in the tank and then refill with fresh water that is being dosed at the right level. It'll be a much quicker part of the process for you. And then measure the levels at the tank so you can show that you've got the target level for circulating around the system. Then you can flush to every outlet, starting at the furthest tap, measuring the levels to ensure that you're getting the target value that you expect. Work back towards the dosing unit, then opening each tap. So once you've opened the furthest tap, it should be a relatively simple process. As you get closer to the dosing plant, then you should get levels there much more quickly. And then, because we're talking about really low dose chlorine dioxide or other treatments here, leave them overnight. Okay, once you've been left overnight, then you can reset the unit to normal level and recommence the flushing process so that you are getting rid of the disinfectant that's built in there until you go below 0.5 milligram per litre at the furthest outlet again. Okay, so in other words, you're going through a process of artificially raising your biocide level, leaving it in the system, and then safely removing it. And only at this point can you remove your warning notices so that people can start to use the water again. You could consider thermal disinfection. Now, thermal disinfection is, well, in my opinion, normally not a reliable strategy, but it can be effective in a one-off situation. Okay, so you need to post warning notices that there is a scald risk, because water at 70 degrees C will be very immediately scalding and painful to anybody exposed to it. So make sure people understand they can not to use the hot water. Then you increase your calorified temperature to 70 degrees C and measure that this is achieved with a digital thermometer. You flush to every outlet for a 5-minute period. So you start at the furthest tap and you measure the temperature to reach a minimum of 60 degrees C. So you're starting at 70, you're expecting to lose some of that heat, but it should come out of the taps at a minimum of 60. and then you work back towards the dosing unit, opening each tap for 5 minutes. But you don't need to use full flow. If you use full flow on this sort of system, not only are you creating more aerosols, but you're also using up the hot water in the system, so that you are going to have less hot water to flush through, aren't you? So please be careful how you do it, but you don't need to use full flow. Once your process is finished, you can reset the unit to a minimum of 60 degrees C and verify that the taps are now just above 50, so they should no longer be above 60 degrees C. Once you've done that, then you can remove your scald risk notices, okay, and get back into some form of normal use. Now, they're just two alternative disinfection strategies. You may well identify others, and you can ask us for advice if you want to do so. That's not a problem. But once you've done your disinfection, then you have to think about reinstating the control measures. So here it's a process of recommissioning. Okay, so there's some guidance in a BSI document, PD 855468, the guide to the flushing and disinfection of services supplying water. Particular clause 5.3.1 is relevant here. But basically requires that you check your water temperatures. You will need to empty your cold water storage tanks in order to get your temperatures back cold, because remember, you've got a large amount of water there which has been warming up during the COVID period. So drain the tanks, refill with fresh water. That will help you to get your water temperatures cold relatively quickly. And then once you've got cold water in your system, flush your cold water, flush your hot water until your normal control measures are achieved. And very simply, more than 50 degrees C at every outlet is the normal control measure, where there is no thermostatic mixer valve fitted, of course. If you have a TMV fitted, then you will need to measure the temperature and the pipework feeding that TMV. And then you continue to flush at least weekly until the building is occupied. It's pointless having your disinfection strategy, reinstating your control measures, and then leaving the building in its current condition without applying those control strategies. So it's not a case of we've done the disinfection, we're ready to open whenever you are. Keep flushing the water system, keep making sure that you're bringing the hot and cold water or your dosed water to each of the sample points, because you can only kill Legionella if you bring the control process into contact with the cells. So where does sampling come in then? Well, sampling provides information on the effectiveness of control measures. It's not a control measure in itself, is it? There's no situation where Legionella will not grow simply because somebody's taken a sample. It simply tells us how effective our control measures are going to be. We also normally recommend that you don't sample immediately post-disinfection. So 7 days is a sort of sensible time period from the disinfection process to when you're going to take your sample. And the reason you don't sample immediately post-disinfection is simply because if you do, all you're doing is sampling the freshly disinfected water. You would not expect to get positive result from that. You need to allow the system to stabilize and allow any Legionella that have survived the disinfection process to recover before you take the samples. So some sampling will be useful, but it will not be necessary to sample every tap in a building, for instance, which is one of the more common queries we've been fielding in the last few days. You need a sampling plan. You also need to understand that the test for Legionella is a 10-day test. So please don't expect an instant result from that, from those samples. You know, it may well be that you'll only get your results after the building has reopened. In which case, you know, we will advise on appropriate corrective action. Okay, but it's not going to be a next day result. So order your bottles now and be ready for your planned reopening. So if you need results that are negative, then get the samples in as early as practicable. And you should certainly consider doing extra sampling in those healthcare care home settings where the vulnerable people are present. Now, I also stress that Legionella test results require interpretation. Now, in our lab, somewhere between 6 and 8% of all Legionella samples or water samples for Legionella are positive. Legionella is a relatively common finding in water systems. That's why we don't talk about elimination, okay? Some organisms should always be absent from drinking water supplies, things like E. coli and so forth, but Legionella will be present. We talk about control. Are the numbers of Legionella in the system low enough to ensure that people will not fall ill if they are if they are exposed to that water. So, you know, when we get test results, we will provide you with an interpretation based on the published guidance from the Health and Safety Executive and any other regulator that's relevant in your domain. When it comes to record keeping, you need to keep a record of your action plan. You need to keep a record of the results of any inspections or tests that you have carried out. You need to keep a record of your flushing activities and indeed the disinfections, how you did them and when they were done. Important information. And then you should also keep a record of all your recommissioning data, temperature and or biocide levels, etc. And then your reopening dates. So, you know, so you can demonstrate that you went through a process to reopen the building before indeed you did reopen it. Now, I'd like you to put yourself in the shoes of an inspector. If an inspector comes to your premises to say, what did you do to reopen the building after you were shut down during the COVID lockdown? If you can show them this record, this action plan, the results of your inspection and test, how much flushing you were doing, what disinfections you did, and the recommissioning data, etc., inspectors are going to be very pleased, aren't they? Okay, so they're going to immediately form the impression these people thought about what the level of risk was from Legionella and they have acted upon it, and they're going to go away and bother somebody else. Okay, so record keeping is really, really important so you can show what you did in the event of any inspection or cases later. Now, we've focused almost entirely today by choice on domestic water services, but obviously cooling systems remain a very significant risk for Legionella infections, so consult us for specific advice on your systems. Pools, especially spa pools, also remain a significant risk, and spa pools really have been drained down entirely during the COVID period. But pools themselves, swimming pools, may also pose some microbial risk. So the Pool Water Treatment Advisory Group has published some very useful information on reinstating pools. So if you need advice on that, then please contact us for a copy of that advice. Water features, well, almost inevitably will need to be cleaned and disinfected because they are generally standalone systems and they have probably been idle during the COVID period. So get them drained, get them cleaned and disinfected. The guidance talks about cleaning and disinfection of all wetted areas in a water feature. Again, you can find more guidance on that in HSG 274 Part 3. Any processed waters that are now going to be used for the first time in a while, well, we strongly recommend that those systems are cleaned and disinfected before they're brought into use as well. Systems like emergency showers and indeed ordinary showers, descale them, clean them and flush the water through. The guidance for emergency showers in the UK talks about flushing through 3 to 5 times the volume of water in the stagnant zone of your emergency shower. So if you know your emergency shower is 10 meters away from the mains supply to the building, then you need to calculate the pipework diameter and how much water is in that part of the system, and then get rid of 3 to 5 times that volume of water. But it is really important that you clean and descale the shower head because that's really where the Legionella is living. So then, do you need help from either Feedwater or Accepta? We can assist you with sampling. We can assist you with risk assessment, both for the COVID period and ongoing. We can help you with inspections, you know, so we can attend buildings and carry out inspections for you. We can also do cleaning and disinfection work and formal recommissioning of systems if required. We can provide water treatment chemicals to end users and indeed other water treatment companies on a known label basis. And we also provide dosing equipment. So if you want to consider having an upgrade on your control program, then please do come and speak to us and we will be able to help you. But we do expect to be busy. You know, we've been busy throughout the COVID period really, and as people reopen, it's going to be even busier. So please don't wait to ask. Do get in touch with us as soon as you can. So in summary then, Legionella and indeed other microbes are an increased risk in the post-COVID-19 period, but that risk can be controlled. Risk assessment is the crucial step. You know, look at your systems. What do we need to do to control risk from this system? A proportionate response is required though. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, and if you have lower risk systems, don't be afraid to identify them as such. As long as you document what your thinking is, then that will be fine in that action plan, of course. Actions dependent on systems, but generally flush, inspect, disinfect, flush again, recommission, sample, and then reopen. If you remember those keywords, then you won't really go far wrong. Now, right at the start, I did introduce you to the phrase of keep it hot or use chemical control, keep it cold or use chemical control, keep it clean, keep it moving. You can summarize what we talk about today as get it hot and or use biocides, get it cold and or use biocides, get it clean, get it moving, and keep it moving. Okay, now if you're able to do all of those things, then you will help to prevent infections, but you can certainly ask us for help if needed. Once you've done all of those things, though, I suggest you sit down and have a cup of tea, because you will indeed have earned it. Okay, so that is all I have to say to you today.